live on YouTube as soon as I can hit that button. And Zali, if you can mute your camera, and Cody as well, just turn your camera off, that'd be great.
In the 1820s, the French mathematician and natural philosopher Joseph Fourier identified that the Earth's atmosphere acted as insulation, and that changes in the composition of the atmosphere could thus affect the temperature of the planet as a whole. In 1912, a New Zealand newspaper reported that mankind was burning dangerous amounts of coal and that this would cause the planet to warm. In 1972, scientists from MIT completed the first computer model of the world, which showed that climate change and a range of other factors would start to impact the quality of life around 2020. In 1992, 154 nations signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. In December 2015, 196 countries adopted the Paris Agreement. And yet, as the clock ticks down to COP26 in Glasgow, carbon dioxide emissions are still rising. The concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is now 30% higher than when I was born and 40% higher than at any time in the last 800,000 years. This last happened about 50 million years ago, and temperatures peaked about 14 centigrade or 25 Fahrenheit higher than the average experience between 1960 and 1990. Unlike 50 million years ago, we're still adding CO2 to the atmosphere incredibly rapidly. So there's no more time for talk. We must now urgently eliminate fossil fuels from our electricity networks and transport systems, and our diets and agricultural practices must change too. So join us on 2nd November for 60 minutes to save the world, to learn what we can each do in just 60 minutes a week to make a real difference. And we won't just talk, we'll put some of the ideas into action live during the show. Register at ESGX.org to join our live audience, ask your own questions and take action. Finally, from me, Nigel Lake in London, and my co-host Paul Herman in San Francisco, a sincere thank you to our ongoing sponsors Pottinger and HIP Investor. We very much look forward to the action.
Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for education and information to inspire collaboration and action on all things to do with sustainability. And a very special episode today coming to you live from London, San Francisco and Sydney, where we're going to explore what we can all do in just an hour a week to have a real impact on climate change in particular. It has been for many, I suspect, a slightly disappointing few days. The G20 did not produce an awful lot of note on the climate change front. In Glasgow, we have seen some quite significant announcements, 100 countries committing to end deforestation. One notable exception on that list being Australia, of course, whose carbon credits have depended on slowing its level of deforestation, if that makes any sense at all. We have seen the US committing to take significant action to reduce methane emissions in the oil and gas industry, not agriculture as I understand it, just oil and gas, still quite significant. And we've also seen an announcement of some support for South Africa as it starts to transition away from coal. So a few announcements, some commitments to net zero excluding fossil fuels, and indeed some countries promoting their fossil fuel industries in Glasgow, which is pretty shocking. Anyway, with no more ado, I'm going to hand it over now to Eliza, Nemser, who is going to be our host for today and to guide us through the discussion. So Eliza, please fire up your camera and sound, and please join us on the stage here.
Well, thank you so much, Nigel, for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. Just a word of introduction. I am actually a geoscientist, but not practicing anymore. About 4 or 5 years ago, I decided that the climate crisis is much scarier than earthquakes, and that's what I got my degrees in, earthquake science. But I pivoted to climate and specifically to climate advocacy and political advocacy and elections, and doing the work that we need to do to pass bold legislation that will help us accelerate the transition to clean energy. So recently co-founded an organization, a nonprofit, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization called Climate Change Makers, with a fellow panelist here today, Cody Sims. And I'm really thrilled about the work that we're doing and building community around reducing the friction to engagement in political action. So that's just some background, and I'm thrilled we're going to cover a lot of ground today on climate advocacy, ranging from what we can do as individuals, what we can do as employees, what we can do as business owners, what we can do as investors, what kind of agency can each of us exercise in this moment to have as outsized of an impact as humanly possible as we confront this challenge in this extremely small and incredibly important window of opportunity. So I'm thrilled to
Fantastic. And by the way, just very quickly for everyone who's joining us, please do introduce yourselves in the chat. So tell us where you're from. If you've got questions, please do ask them in the Q&A. If you ask them in the chat, we will try to get to those too, but it's harder to spot them. So as I say, please introduce yourselves in the chat and then we know who's out there.
Excellent. I'm really thrilled to introduce Cody Sims, a partner at MCJ Collective, and Ian Monroe, the founder, president, and CIO of Etho Capital. We are fellow travelers on this journey to understand how we can have the greatest impact and all of the ways we can have the greatest impact. And I think we're going to start this conversation focused on political action and what can we do in that sphere. And then we will welcome a very special guest and actually do some live action and then broaden the conversation to how we can have an impact with our investments, in what kind of role does tech have in this conversation, et cetera. So I wanted to start out with this very important and very new concept that has just been introduced. And it's a renaming of the notion of a carbon footprint. And it's actually kicking that to the curb. Instead, the talk now is about a climate shadow. And that is an effort to describe how each of our impact actually can far exceed our carbon emissions, right? We each have spheres of influence. And if we exercise our agency within those spheres of influence, we can have a tremendously outsized impact. There are playbooks for this. There are playbooks for having an outsized impact as a citizen. There are playbooks for having an outsized impact as an employee. There are playbooks for having an outsized impact as an investor. And Cody and Ian and I are all doing the work of writing the playbooks and connecting people to those playbooks so that we can extend our climate shadow as far and wide as possible. So I would say that because we're going to start with this political element, I think it's important to talk about voting, and everyone needs to do it. And not everyone does do it. There is a phenomenal organization that we at Climate Change Makers partner with a lot called the Environmental Voter Project. And they have a very clean mission. They are trying to get folks for whom climate is a top issue, but are not reliable voters, identified and to the polls. It's very clean. Not enough people vote. So we'd all need to vote, but we all need to level up. And we really need to level up our civic engagement at this moment. And that means in a democracy, reaching out to our elected officials. A surprisingly few number of people actually do this. And why? Because this type of advocacy actually takes time. And I think that is a theme of our conversation today, how to save the planet in 60 minutes. The 60 minutes is the key part because you can't do this kind of work with a couple clicks, right? It actually takes time to be an effective advocate. So I'd love to talk about what kind of outsized impact we can have using community and collective action. And Cody, I'm going to throw it right to you, because I know you've done a lot of work in community building around climate in the tech community and beyond. So what have you learned about community building for climate action, and how can we how can we be greater than the sum of our parts?
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Eliza, and thank you to the ESGX team for having me here. It's such an exciting topic. As Eliza mentioned, obviously I've been part of along on the journey with her as one of the co-founders of Climate Changemakers for the last few years. And also currently I'm a partner at MCJ, or My Climate Journey, which is also emerged as a climate community really around innovation and technology as it relates to climate change. So between those two worlds, for the last 2 years, I've sort of been immersed in the world of climate community building. And I think a few things really hold true to me. One, I really want to use a tech term, to double click on that climate shadow comment that you mentioned. And it's such a refreshing term to hear, because it's so important for all of us to think about our own personal agency. The notion of your climate footprint, as many of us know, was actually coined originally by the fossil fuel industry in order to try to make each of us feel responsible for our own choices as it relates to climate change. And of course, our own choices matter, but we all know, sort of that there are really a handful or a few dozen significantly large companies that are causing the bulk of carbon emissions around the world. So yes, our individual choices matter, but there's obviously changes that need to happen at a systemic level that are incredibly important. And what's great about the notion of your climate shadow is it's turning it from a blame game of like, what are you doing in your life? To more of an enablement and empowerment game of how are you actually helping to encourage more and more people to take their own personal initiative and also try to be bigger than themselves. And so one of the things I've learned about community building over the last few years in the climate space is there are so many people who care about climate change and know that they need to care, but don't know what to do or how to help. And the best way for a lot of people to learn how to help is to raise their hand and volunteer to try to do something on a project team. So they may not be willing to dive into something where they're having to learn by themselves, but they will learn collectively with other people. And that learning could be taking political action, like how to call your members of Congress. That learning could be writing a letter to the editor. That learning could be how do they actually even learn how to put climate language in their own words so they can have a dinner table conversation. And just getting together and having a collective outlet to do that is amazing. Even on the technology side of things, that learning can be, what are some of the interesting technologies that are showing up today? If I've spent 10 years working at Google and I didn't work on climate stuff, and I know tech, but I don't know how to apply it to climate, it's really intimidating at first. But if I get together with a number of other people like me and we share what we've learned together, we all grow our knowledge together. And that notion of climate community building just feels like it's snowballing right now. There is so much activity happening in this space where all of us are getting smarter together and learning how to be effective together, leveraging the skills we already have.
Thanks, Cody. And I just want to clarify, I think there is a widespread misconception that climate footprint came from fossil fuel companies. I think it was not coined by them, but they certainly have amplified the daylights out of the notion because they have a lot to gain by deflecting responsibility onto the individual. Whereas, in fact, as individuals, we can have such an outsized impact when we exercise our collective agency and certainly pull on big levers like political ones. Ian, I want to loop you in here. You and I have talked a lot about the idea of a climate shadow. I know that the term has like a negative connotation, maybe isn't the world's best, but it definitely takes us in the direction we need to go, where we're encompassing political action, collective action, civic engagement, when we think about our own impact. So I want to hear the way you're thinking about this, and I also want to hear. I mean, you are part of a community, an ESG and investment community that's very sustainably minded, and I want to hear how the community operates to push each other to accelerate progress. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Eliza. Yeah, it's certainly a conversation that I'm really glad we're having, because climate footprint, it's better than nothing. But what I don't like about the term is it's kind of inherently very backward looking. It's just looking at your footprints behind you. And it's also only giving the context of negative directionality. It's just leaving an imprint, as opposed to thinking that you can have a positive climate sphere of influence as well. So a lot of what we do at Etho Capital, and what I've done in my career even before it with climate sustainability tracking and gamification with OroEco and my work at Stanford University, is thinking about what is the net climate impact of people, of products and services, of companies overall. For Etho Capital, really focused on looking at the net climate impact of companies, and really trying to think beyond the traditional climate footprinting approach to more of a broad-based climate sphere of influence. And we're continuously working to improve this. But there actually was just a great article in the New York Times that I put a link to for everyone just this morning, talking about how, while companies are mainstreaming this conversation about wanting to get to net zero and be part of a climate solution, companies themselves still are doing very poorly in terms of calculating their overall climate impacts and being transparent about that. And most importantly, companies are generally lacking in reporting what's called Scope 3 emissions, which particularly relate to what is connected to a company's supply chain, as well as the downstream side of what happens, what are the climate implications of when a company's products and services go out into the world. And as the New York Times rightly pointed out, and as we've seen with now years of research at Etho Capital, when you look at this Scope 3 upstream supply chain and downstream climate impact for companies, that's generally a huge majority of a company's climate impacts, often over 90%, it can even be 99%. And so we really need to be looking much more broadly at the climate impact implications for us as individuals, and also for companies. And the cool thing we've seen with Etho Capital is when you look much more broadly at a company's net climate impacts, I like the terminology of climate influence or climate sphere of influence a bit more than climate shadow. But whatever you use in terms of your terminology, when you look more broadly, look at the net climate impacts for companies that are climate leaders, those that have better impacts relative to their peers, those tend to make actually just for better investments as well. And so you can construct investment strategies around companies that are more decarbonized relative to their peers. And you can even calculate companies that have a net climate benefit, companies that are net climate positive, because you're incorporating in the influence that companies have in terms of what happens when their climate impacts connect up to their products and services after those products and services go out into the world. So for example, a solar company or a wind company can be net climate positive because of the climate benefits that renewable energy has once it gets out into the world. Similarly, a sustainable food company can be net climate positive. So that's a lot of what we do at Etho Capital, is this full climate impact accounting for companies, and then actually turning those calculations into strategies that are substantially decarbonized and even net climate positive. And we're really excited about the direction that the climate impact investing community is moving, but there's still this pretty big gap between rhetoric and reality. We're at this point right now where everybody is talking about climate change. If you're a large company, certainly, and even smaller companies, you kind of have to be talking about climate change because all investors are now talking about climate change as well. But there's still a large gap between talk and action. And another piece that we're just starting to think about, and I've been geeking out with Eliza a bit about how can we put numbers on this, is what about the footprint of a company's political engagement? And companies both can have positive directionality with what they're doing in terms of climate, and certainly negative directionality. Famously, the fossil fuel industry for years has put out misinformation, funded misinformation, sometimes overtly, often behind the scenes, to try to slow progress on climate policies. There are increasingly companies now that are actually actively engaging and pushing for better climate policies that ultimately decarbonize well beyond their direct company sphere of influence. So that's something that we're just starting to think about. It is something that the initial numbers we've looked at, it looks extremely important, which really gets back to why what Climate Change Makers is doing, what Eliza is leading, is so important with Cody as well. The numbers I've seen so far, based on analysis from an NGO called Giving Green, indicate that giving to political engagement actually has the highest climate impact. For every dollar donated, they estimated, at least for political action here in the US, it results in up to 14 tons of emissions reductions, which is a far, far cheaper price than saving carbon elsewhere if you look in the offset world or the carbon removal world. So anyway, it gets a bit geeky when we talk about, whether we should say climate footprint, climate sphere of influence, climate shadow. But I think what we all agree on is we need to do a much better job of just accounting for those full impacts. And those impacts really matter when it comes to your investment decisions and when it comes to optimizing where you decide to focus your time and how we can actually change and get to the climate future that we want with climate action.
Thank you,
Ian, to double click on something there. One thing that I've observed is a number of companies whose businesses seemingly have nothing to do with climate that are starting to do more and more in the climate sphere. And it's particularly companies that have either a long purview of where they want their business to be, and thus realize that they need to take action now in order to continue to service their customers in the future, or they're simply aspirationally minded. I'll give two examples. One is Shopify, which powers small business owners around the world building e-commerce shops. You wouldn't think that naturally has anything to do with climate change, and they're not a resource-heavy company in any way, but they have set a goal that they want to be a 100-year company, and that they want to empower small business owners. And when they look at one of the biggest risks facing their small business owners years out in the future, it's risk of financial loss due to climate change. And so as a result, as a business, they're funding carbon removal projects on the technology side, which is just an amazingly foresight into how they can evolve a marketplace for themselves. Then you look at a totally different direction. Someone who runs a small business content marketing agency named Campfire Labs is an entrepreneur named Michael Thomas, and he cares a lot about climate change and has decided he wants to give 50% of the profits of his business to climate change oriented organizations. So those are both companies that are, casting, whether you want to call it a shadow or whatever you want to call it, they're casting a web that is much larger than themselves for reasons that they believe are either positive to humanity or positive to their ultimate future of their business. But in either case, they're realizing that investing significantly into climate change is actually helpful to the businesses that they're trying to build.
Yeah. And I'll highlight a few other companies that I think are doing particularly exciting things that you wouldn't necessarily think about that. And we're seeing a lot here in the Bay Area and the tech world that increasingly are getting into climate. There's Salesforce, which certainly isn't known for climate, but they started looking at their own climate footprint in more detail and created this sustainability cloud software that now that they're making available to others as well. Intuit, the company behind things like TurboTax and QuickBooks, they have a pledge to actually be 30 times climate positive. So they are looking at their full company climate footprint, and they want to have 30 times that in terms of positive impact on the climate. Still very much to be determined exactly how they get there and the accounting that goes into that. but at least the aspirational goals coming out of some of these tech titans around me are relatively exciting. With that said, you can also, I think, level the justifiable criticism to say, hey, if you're a tech company, you're not in a very carbon intensive industry. You can shift your servers over to run on renewables. So you have a lot more leeway to get to net zero and even net positive a lot faster than companies that are primarily selling products that are physical products and services. But I do think there is a lot of excitement that is actually coming from what companies are pledging. And some of that is investors are increasingly asking for it, but then companies are actually showing investors that there really can be more exciting possibilities and that there's not necessarily a trade-off between decarbonizing and profits. Actually, companies can be really decarbonized and quite profitable and competitive at the same time.
Excellent. Okay, let's, I'm watching the chat and this idea of top 10 list of actions. And I want to volunteer what I think might be the #1 action. And it's really to make a commitment to be a climate change maker. Like as an individual, as a business, as an employee, I am going to lean into that as an identity and acknowledge that that means putting a little skin in the game. And to be an effective advocate, that takes a little bit of time. I also saw an excellent shout out for Climate Voice. They're a strong partner at Climate Change Makers, as is Drawdown Labs of Project Drawdown. We've been working together to pull on this really, really big lever that is policy. Like we are in a moment in time right now. We need to pull on that very big lever. And Cody and Ian just gave tremendous examples of businesses really doing the right thing. There are also businesses doing the right thing and yet supporting as members, trade associations that are actively lobbying to kill climate legislation. And so that is very important that we factor that into this holistic look at how our role as actors, the role of business as actors, the role of individuals as actors. So speaking about the big lever that is policy, we need to have the right people, the right constellation of elected leaders to write and pass that policy. It's absolutely fundamental. And I am going to pitch it back to you, Nigel, to introduce our very special guest and talk about that, going for gold, so to speak, both as a skier, I understand, and as a leader, an elected leader and policymaker.
Fantastic. And if there was ever a country that needed climate action as one of the absolute champions in being a pariah, it is Australia. And I'm unusual in that I lived in Australia for a period of time, and unlike many, I have a representative who took the ultimate step and became an MP herself. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Zali Steggall into the discussion, who is joining us from Sydney, where it's already tomorrow. So good morning, Zali. It's wonderful to have you here. And I guess, unlike most who need to take action to try to get their representative to do something, I have a representative who's already doing that. So my starting question was going to be, what do you need from your constituents? What do you want from people out there that are advocating? What's helpful?
Well, hi, Nigel, and hi, everyone. And if I could start by paying my respects to Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging on the land on which I'm coming from. It's very important when we talk sustainability and climate that we actually recognise, cultures that have actually survived on the earth with a much lesser footprint than what our current culture does. And we can learn a lot from all cultures. Yeah, look, obviously the community, I guess for everyone watching, probably not familiar with Northern Beaches in Sydney, in Australia. I'm in an area that is traditionally a very conservative area. We had an MP that had been in the seat for 25 years. In fact, the previous Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. And this is a seat that since Federation has been conservative. So it was quite a shift for the electorate to really recognise that whilst being, what one would probably traditionally describe as fiscally conservative, certainly not, socially or left-leaning, but very strong on integrity and values and climate. So progressive on those social issues that so many people are really engaging with. And so we saw an electorate that had been so conservative turn to, I ran as an independent member of parliament, an independent politician. So in Australia, we have the very polarised, dual party system of politics, quite similar to the US, I would say, and the UK. And I don't think that is serving people very well because it's monopolising the debate, but it's also not giving people much choice at election time. And in Australia, we are having more and more a movement around independent members of parliament. So we're not party affiliated. We are directly responsible by our communities and we're powered by our communities essentially. So, a huge amount of volunteers and fundraising from within my community to really choose to put me forward as their voice rather than a traditional party machine. So I guess my call is for communities is you have to own your democracy. Our democracy is the most valuable thing we have. Your vote is the most powerful tool you have, but you have to make it count. And so it's really important to be informed and active. Maybe it's my sporting background, Nigel, but for me, it was about the common sense of the opportunity that you just, there is so much at stake, and so much sensible policy is being overlooked because of vested interests, right? The dual party system, the convention of politics, they are not looking to change the status quo. They want to keep their power base. And so it's
absolutely.
Really
and Australia has compulsory voting. It has ranked choice voting, which can help. And I know in the US, Andrew Yang, this is the big thing that he's now campaigning for. Whether it will ever happen is another thing. But I think that for me, the fundamental point is leave that aside. You were in a constituency where the incumbent had won previously with well over 60% of the vote, if maybe the time before last, and you won 57-43, mobilizing people that were as ardently conservative as my mother-in-law to be down there at the Spit Junction waving banners. It really struck a mood because in Australia, as in many places, the large majority of the population supports action.
Absolutely. And I think it's maybe where the climate debate has gone wrong, especially in Australia, is it's been polarised and pitched as a political, on the political spectrum, is it a left-leaning issue? And so because traditionally it's been more progressive parties have maybe argued the case for climate action, or it's been seen as and I don't mean any offence, but as a, lefty, greeny kind of social reconstruction kind of topic, it has disaffected probably a lot of other voters. And for me, what was really important was bringing forward, I'd say, sensible centre, down the middle. I'm not polarised by sort of party politics, but bringing forward the sensible case for change. We have to acknowledge the risks that we face, and especially Australia, we are at high risk when it comes to global warmings and the environmental impacts we will suffer, but also the high opportunity. And this is where, as an Olympic athlete, I am right up for a competitive environment and taking advantage of competitive advantage and, really looking to win and set Australia up. So for me, it was absolutely a win-win scenario that you have to come forward with sensible policy. And without, the blame of the past doesn't help. We need to really empower people to feel positive about the actions they can take. There's no point on being paralysed by doom and gloom.
Absolutely. And there's a huge amount that can be done. I know from our own work around renewable energy, there's just a huge amount of money flowing into investment in renewables. You've got two of the country's most successful entrepreneurs of the last 20 years. So Andrew Forrest from Fortescue Metals, pushing an agenda around green hydrogen, Mike Cannon-Brookes exporting solar energy to Singapore, also working with Andrew Forrest. There's a huge amount of enthusiasm from arguably the best people in the business community to drive that. And yet there is still, we have Australia's political representatives right now in Glasgow promoting fossil fuels. So where does that lead for you? Because I think the thing that's fascinating for me is there is the Australian politics in this, but I think what you're doing is also very relevant to world politics, because hopefully it sends a message that there may be some people in power that aren't trying to drive change, but there are an awful lot of others who think differently.
Yeah, and look, I think Australia is an interesting example. We have our federal government that is monopolised and really held to, at the beck and call of fossil fuel industry. And we have to acknowledge fossil fuel and, coal export has played a huge part of Australia's prosperity, and that is going to require a managed transition, right? Many communities are very exposed and need to sort of some clear planning. But that debate has been I think the conservative side of politics has fear-mongered, has really scared, and there's been a lot of misinformation around the opportunities of the transition to a net zero world. I would say Australia, like the US, we have Murdoch Media, which plays a huge part in our debate in terms of getting that correct information, instead of misinformation as to climate and cost and those issues. It was interesting, your discussion, though, about the leadership the private sector's taking. So what we're seeing more than anything in Australia is our state governments and our federal and our private sector businesses are by far leading the way. And the problem is we still then have a handbrake at federal government level, and the lack of legislation and proper levers and framework is what is holding back the full blowout of investment that's possible, which is why I'm trying to introduce legislation in the Australian Parliament, and we're 3 votes short from getting it. So there's a strong push for more independents to get in at the next federal election to enable that to happen. But what private companies are doing is fantastic. I recently had a webinar with the CEO for Australia New Zealand of Unilever, Nikki Spesher, and Cameron Adams, one of the co-founders of Canva. Now, that is a classic company, as you were saying before. It is not a company that, this is a marketing and a presentation tool company. But
most people on this probably know Canva already. They probably use it somewhere in their business, but founded in Sydney.
Absolutely. Phenomenal company, but with very high social and environmental governance standards, high commitment to net zero. They will be, renewable, 100% renewable by 2024. They have a policy of print one, plant one, so they really offset any printing with planting trees. And they have a whole of company approach. And these are the companies of tomorrow. Our young people, millennials and younger, want to be involved in proactive, dynamic, cool, companies that have that social and environmental governance in place.
Fantastic. And Eliza, I'm going to throw back to you now. I don't know if you've got a question you want to ask, but over to you.
I do. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to have you here, Zali, and I want to thank you for leading with the land acknowledgement. So I have a question for you. We're here in the United States. Climate is one of the most, if not the most, politicized issues, which I think is a wild, wild shame and problem. And I am one of the few kind of raging against the machine. We need to deal with it. We need to deal with elections through a climate lens. We need to talk about policy that centers science and justice and throw the partisan rhetoric out. Just leave it at the door. Because in my view, weaponizing climate as a partisan issue benefits no one but the bad actors, right? So, but I want to thank you for your leadership as an environmental justice champion. A question I get a lot, and I am building this community to train effective advocates. I get the question of, should I bother calling my rep? They're already an enormous environmental champion. Should I bother calling my senator? They are a terrible vote on climate. They're just never vote in favor of environmental protections. There's so much extremism that I think that's where we lose a lot of would-be, active citizens, more actively engaged. So what would you tell someone that you represent? What should they say to someone like you? And then give me the other example as well.
Well, look, it's very important. At the end of the day, I don't really think of myself as a politician yet. I think of myself as a lawyer and a skier and many other things. But what has been really interesting to observe in Parliament has been, look, they are ultimately all worried about their job. You know, at the end of the day, they want to be re-elected, and whatever the term period is of the jurisdiction in which you're being elected, you do have to go back out there and win those votes. And so feedback matters. So it's important for me to hear from constituents that they are following what I'm doing, and they're supportive of legislation I'm introducing and campaigns we're doing around climate and how we can actually, you know, where all our opportunities are. But it's also important, if your MP is not a climate champion, to let them know that this will impact your vote, that you simply will not vote for them. But also think of your network. So a big part of the independent movement is think about building your tribe. So if every person talks to every member of their family and their friends or work network, and every one of those people talk to another 10, you know, one person speaks to 10 and 10 speak to another 10, you very quickly move the dial in terms of building a tribe, of having the conversation. And look, not everyone is receptive, but you have to be respectful in the conversation. You know, I always say you've got to seek to understand before being understood. So when we have, you know, those discussions and broaden it, each individual has a huge amount of power with their local representative and their MP. And so writing, being engaged, writing to your local newspaper, calling into your radio station, writing on social media, comments and feedbacks, you are influencing people. And I do believe, you know, the curve of change, of disruption, it accelerates gradually until it reaches a tipping point. And none of us know when we're going to reach that tipping point until we're over that threshold and we're finally there. But every additional voice adds to that, you know, acceleration towards the tipping point. And I do believe this is a crisis and a global challenge that we can't ever quit. You know, you can't ever give up on this one. And as you say, it's not a political partisan issue, because at the end of the day, impacts of global warming will not discriminate. They will not care who you voted for, what your position was in relation to this issue. The impacts will be universal and they will impact your life profoundly. So it really is not a left or right issue.
Okay, well, you have given me the confidence. I mean, I do this all the time, but it's still kind of scary. I'm just going to admit it. Making a phone call to your elected representative, it's a little intimidating. And this conversation has given me the added confidence to do this on a live streaming program. All right, so here we go. I am going to do a demonstration because, again, this is one of the things you can fit into 60 minutes. You can really fit this into 60 minutes. I am going to call my senator, and I am going to ask her to act right now, because we have transformative climate policy on the line right now in the United States. We absolutely need to pass it. And I'm going to call and ask her to do everything she can. She's a strong leader on climate. I have 2 strong senators in California. I'm going to call. And then after I call, I'm going to ask Nick to put up a script so that folks can just see this just isn't rocket science, right? Like, hi, this is who I am. This is why I care. I'm your constituent. This is what I'm asking you to do. Thank you so much for your leadership. There's a formula here. But we don't want to fully just read a script. It's very, very important that we inject something authentic about ourselves into these conversations. There are actually empirical data showing in terms, you cannot move policymaker opinion with generic cookie cutter messages, but with personalized communications, you truly can. So I am going to make this phone call right now. And then to your point, Zali, when I'm done making the phone call, I'm going to tell everyone I did it. Because that is just as important. Spreading the word, bringing other people in, demystifying the process is just as important as my phone call. But we need leaders. So here I'm going to do this. So I've got the phone number of the switchboard for the United States Congress. You see, here I go. Wish me luck. And I'm going to have it on speakerphone. This was all your idea, Ian.
Capital, may I help you?
Hi, yes, I would like to be connected to Senator Dianne Feinstein's office, please.
Thank you for calling the Washington, D.C. office of Senator Dianne Feinstein. Our office is open from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday.
I will be
Friday.
leaving a voicemail.
Although we miss your call, we regularly check voicemails.
I will be
and
leaving a
pass
voicemail.
along
Here we go.
a message to Senator Feinstein. If you're calling because you need personal assistance or help with a federal agency, please visit our website at feinstein.senate.gov and fill out a casework form. If you would like to leave a message, please do so after the tone.
Here I go. I'm gonna leave my message.
Respond. You can email our office at
You can go ahead and show the script.
feinstein.senate.gov, or you may visit our website and submit a letter. Thank you for calling and have a great day.
Hi, my name is Eliza Nemser, and I am a constituent calling from San Francisco, California. I am a geoscientist and I'm a parent. And I know that the science is abundantly clear. We are on a trajectory for catastrophic global warming and biodiversity loss. But I also know that we have agency. And if we act now, we can avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So I'm calling to urge Senator Feinstein to do everything in her power to ensure that Congress passes the Build Back Better Act. The climate provisions in the bill are very strong, and they'll set us on a path to cut emissions by half by 2030. And that way we can meet our commitment under the Paris Agreement. The United States has a responsibility to lead on the world stage, and truly it's an ethical responsibility to lead on climate. So now is the time for the senator to use all of her negotiating power and her influence to make sure we pass the bill. So thank you so much for passing along my concerns, and please thank the senator for her service and for her leadership. Woo! All right, done and done. Okay, so it didn't hurt too much. It was about a minute, and now I get to go tell everyone I did it. And you can see this, the best script for these calls is actually a template and not a cookie cutter script. So the homework for this for after this event is to actually do this. And you can Google a congressional switchboard in the US. In any country, you live in a democracy, you can get the phone number to call your elected representative. So there's actually homework. And then the second part of the homework is to spread the word that you've done it. It didn't hurt too much, and you exercised your agency as a constituent. Zali, please, yes.
I was just going to add to it. So as an MP, for example, we get a lot of emails, and the cookie cutter, the campaign emails tend to get sorted as a campaign block, and so don't get individual attention. So you're right, good to individualize your message and your communication. But what's really important is be thorough in what response you get. So if your senator or MP gives you the party line back, you have to question that. You have to test that in what are their individual actions on behalf of this issue, on behalf of their electorate, that they are actually doing. But also, if you fail to get a response, or you get a poor response, or a really, toe the party line kind of response, let people know that too, because now, if there's one thing that politicians do, they spend a lot of money on marketing and on advertising, on getting people to think they're good people that are going to do the right thing by them, so vote for you. But if they're not, you need to let people know. So to make sure when you write to your local newspaper, call into your local radio show, tell your experience. So I called my local senator and I didn't get a call back for 3 months, or I didn't hear from them, or they refused to take a meeting, or they just gave me the party line. They didn't know what they were talking about. Really important to actually expose when there is laziness.
Thank you so much. I think that's critically important. And I'd love to bring back Cody and Ian, who I know have made their calls, right? Have you made your call on the Build Back Better Act on the climate provisions? Okay, super. So thank you so much. I mean, it is really important that we advocate as citizens. We go above and beyond voting. We have so much agency there. It's important to use our networks. Absolutely. It's important to, if we happen to have a personal relationship with a policymaker, to reach out to them. It's important to be congenial across the board. And supportive, and we are actually on the same team and the same boat that's going to sink if we don't get this right. So Ian and Cody, I'd like to broaden the conversation a little bit away from the political lever, which you know that I am completely obsessed with, and let's talk about some of the other huge levers. So Ian, I'm going to go back to you because we all have, many people have a bank account. Many of us have money, assets that are doing some work. And how do we make sure that we are moving beyond a do no harm ethos and actually doing good with everything that we have?
Yeah, I think it's important for us all to think about and realize that if we are fortunate enough to have investments, those investments have climate impacts, because ultimately we are stakeholders in all these companies around the world that are causing climate problems, and in some cases contributing to climate solutions. So the calculations we've done at Etho Capital, we found that for every dollar invested in the global stock market, it's about a third of a kilogram of CO2 emissions per year that's connected to that investment. So you can scale that up if you have, say, $100,000 invested for retirement. That's about 30 tons of greenhouse gas emissions equivalent per year that your investment is connected to. That's pretty substantial. That's actually about as much as the average US household, just in terms of your average daily activities in your household, connected up to your home energy use, connected up to your driving, flying, your personal consumption choices, et cetera. And there are certainly all sorts of ways we can decarbonize our own personal lifestyle at home. I put up a link earlier to carbon footprint calculators, or carbon sphere of influence calculators, that have been put out by the Cool Climate Network that's supported by UC Berkeley. So they're free, they're great. You can see ranked what are the top things that you can do in your life to decarbonize your lifestyle based on where you live and what your lifestyle is actually like. So I highly recommend you checking those out. But what's missing from those calculators are what you do in terms of political engagement, like we were just talking about, and also what you do in terms of your investments. So the homework that I'd like to assign to all of you listening and all of you who share this with others and engage with your friends and family and otherwise your community about this is to take 1 hour at some point, put it on your calendar, and just sort out where your investments currently are and think about, are they invested in climate problems? Could they be shifted into climate solutions? And most of us typically are now investing in these broad-based index funds that invest broadly across the global stock market or the US stock market. And probably it means your footprint is similar to those calculations that I was mentioning. So $100,000 invested again equals around 30 tons per year on average invested in the global stock market. What we at Etho Capital have been working on recently that we're really excited about is actually trying to create climate positive strategies, where every dollar invested is not actually contributing to climate pollution, but actually net contributing to carbon emissions reductions. And we're really excited now to this week actually be launching a new climate positive climate action strategy in collaboration with another impact investing firm called New Day, based out of the Bay Area as well. I'm sharing a link for anybody who wants to check it out. It's newdayimpact.com/climate action, has more about the strategy. And ultimately, we're working with New Day to create a mix of companies that are climate leaders in terms of being less pollution companies per dollar invested relative to their industry peers. And many of these companies are also net climate positive companies, where every dollar invested in them actually reduces emissions because they're a renewable energy company or electric vehicle company or sustainable food company. And so the net impact of investing in the portfolio actually is beneficial in terms of climate change rather than net pollution. And we're also really excited that as part of this, we're collaborating with climate change makers to donate a portion of revenue for the fund to support the amazing work that they're doing. Because again, like I talked about earlier, actually the highest value thing that you can do with a lot of your time and money in terms of climate is engaging politically with your time, or if you don't have the time to engage, effectively donating to organizations that are doing it really effectively. And we think climate change makers is a pretty amazing one. So our view is donate as much as you can to support this kind of work, donate as much of your time as you can to support this kind of work. You probably don't want to donate all your money. You want to save some to invest and grow. And we hope that this climate positive strategy will do that as well, and also return to have even more impact by supporting climate change makers. But whether or not this is the right strategy for you, the homework I'd like to assign to everybody again is to think about how you've currently invested. Does it have a net benefit to climate or a net emissions, pollutions contribution to climate? And think about how you can shift that and shift into solutions. And actually, a lot of the data that we've seen so far and what we've done with our other strategies at Etho Capital shows that actually investing in climate leaders, investing in climate positive companies generally does just as well, if not better, than conventional approaches. So we're really excited to be continuing to push the envelope with what we're doing with New Day and climate change makers.
Well, we're thrilled as well. We are truly thrilled. A lot of climate-related philanthropy historically, at least in the United States, funds 501c3 work, which is actually really prohibited from engaging in a lot of the type of political work that we need to actually accomplish in order to move big policy. So we're really excited about this partnership and the vote of confidence in this work and the recognition of the value in this work. So I love that you have homework here, Ian, and I also really appreciate the theme that you kind of need to carve out the time to do this stuff, right? So we've talked through some playbooks, and there's definitely a list in the chat, and there's the list of the things you can do. Flying less is at the top, towards the top. I want to go back to the playbooks. I mean, Zali ran for office and became a policymaker. That's a playbook right there, a phenomenal playbook. We just walked through the playbook of, we talked about the voting playbook and walked through the playbook of calling our electeds to advocate. Ian's talking through the investment playbook. Cody, and we've talked a bit about the employee playbook. And again, I think the drawdown resource is the penultimate for this. I hope that someone shared that in the Slack. They have this, every job should be a climate job, and they have a true playbook for employees on how to step up and agitate gracefully and congenially in their workplace for more action. Cody, do you have a playbook to share from the kind of entrepreneurial side? I mean, you have spent decades working with startups.
Yeah.
Let's hear that playbook.
Yeah, happy to share. First of all, just want to say, thank you again to Ian for the work you're doing with Etho and New Day to support climate change makers, which Eliza and I have been, pouring our blood, sweat, and tears into for the last close to 2 years. So we're really excited about that partnership. The other thing I do is that as I mentioned, I work at My Climate Journey, which is both a community, a podcast, and a venture fund around climate. So while, Ian and Etho are focused on public companies and helping you build your portfolio around public companies, I am much further upstream than that, working with startups, entrepreneurs, people who are building businesses from the beginning. And so, a few things that I can share. One, obviously, if you have interest in exposure of, investing in some of the most cutting edge climate technology startups out there, certainly happy to tell you about what we're doing with My Climate Journey and our venture funds and the exposure we're gaining there to helping push forward new technologies around carbon removal, around energy transmission, around food and ag, around mobility. That's a separate topic. Happy to share more. But I think the message I really want to share, back to Ian's idea of homework, is think about how you can support an entrepreneur working in climate. And By entrepreneur, I don't necessarily mean tech startup. Though great if you want to support a tech startup. But if you're a business that hires designers, if you're a business that hires marketers, if you're a business that that hires a PR firm, and you have anything to do with climate, think about leaning into an agency that specializes in those things, because that's you giving your money back to small businesses that themselves are trying to build more of a voice and a presence for climate. And there are more and more of those every day. In the climate community that we help manage with My Climate Journey, it's not just tech startups. Eliza and I started Climate Changemakers inside the My Climate Journey community originally. So it gave birth to a political action nonprofit. We work closely with a marketing firm called The Regenerates that are doing climate positioning and branding and marketing, helping companies from startups to folks like public companies that you've heard of actually brand and manage how they talk about themselves from a climate perspective and build that equity story into everything they do. Those types of avenues, if you're investing in just a business to business contract with an organization like that, you're helping with climate action. That is also climate action, because you're empowering people who are helping this mission forward with your dollars and with your cash flow, which helps them build their business and do more good in the world. So that would be the playbook I would ask you to do, is as you're thinking about the next firm you want to hire, contract you want to sign, think about what is the relationship this organization has to climate, and is there a way I could actually bring a climate friendly organization into partnership with my company in some way, shape, or form.
Thank you, Cody. So I love it. It's all about assuming the identity of a climate change maker. And Nigel, thank you for the opportunity for us to have this discussion, which I think we all agree we would be happy to go on for another hour, but I am going to hand it back to you in the interest of time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Eliza. And thank you all, Zali, Cody, Ian, for what's been a really, I think, enlivening and encouraging conversation. I think everything around action on climate change and sustainability can feel like a bit of a lonely journey. And we had Jane Goodall on a few weeks ago, and one of her messages was, find something that you can do, that you can act on, and start there. And if you do that, you can start to have an effect. And as she said, you'll probably find some other people who are doing something next to you that's having an effect too. And before you know it, you have a movement, you have a tribe that's all pulling in the same direction and driving change. So I think this has been, for me, has been absolutely wonderful. And I think the other really important message is that every time you speak out, every time you make a post on social media or you make some small supportive comment, other people see that. And I've seen in what I do, you don't notice it day by day, but the number of people that are supporting what you're doing changes over the months and grows, and people that maybe didn't have the confidence to speak out. And we've seen this in Australia, where now you have the Business Council Australia, which is one of the leading business bodies, taking a much more forceful role in starting to advocate for change. So with that, I will say a sincere thank you to anybody who is watching this on YouTube. Thank you very much for joining us there. Please do use the like button or the share button. This does get this message out to a wider audience. And if Paul is there with us, I will get him to do a quick heads up as to what's coming up. So Paul, what have we got coming up next week?
Here I am. Sorry, I had to stop typing all the action ideas. It made a very long list, longer than a top 10. Looks like it's almost a top 50. So coming up on ESGX next week, we have the quote halftime report, whether you're a fan of football, the soccer version, or football, the American version. We have the halftime report at COP26. Nigel's on the ground in the UK. And then Blair Palese from Australia will join, as well as me. I'll be tracking all the news and social media. Nigel may have live feedback and interviews. Nigel will not be taking one of the 400 private jets that have landed in Glasgow, and I'm sure we'll be taking the train.
I will be taking the train, and I do hope to get a shot of Dan Illich's fine billboards.
Please do. And there are others who are friends of ESGX that will seek to get quotes and interviews from. So please join us for that halftime report next week, November 9th in the States, November 10th in Australia. And then the following week, we have another book launch. Remember, there's an ESGX bookshelf and bookstore. It's great for holiday gifts. The latest book, including the Jane Goodall's Book of Hope, the latest book is Going Climate Positive. So David Jaber brings together a panel of how to take action to go climate positive in your life and in your business. Very tangible, very action oriented, and we're delighted to have him with us. And then at the end of the month, we'll have the latest Green Jobs report. We now have blended all the green jobs statistics into a US economy score. And we will share how sustainable or not the US economy is pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID as we approach post-COVID. So please join us for that at the end of the month. The week of US Thanksgiving, there will be no ESGX, but come on back for November 30th. So really appreciate everyone joining us today. Minister Zali Steggall from Australia, thank you for joining. Dr. Eliza Nemser, thank you for showing us live how to call your representatives. So hope everybody can do that. And Cody Sims, thanks for all your hard work. And Ian Moreau of Ethel Capital, delighted to have you with us. On behalf of Nick Gower, our producer, Nigel Lake, my co-host, currently in London, headed to Glasgow, me in San Francisco, soon to be in Chicago. Thanks for joining ESGX.